Just waiting for Keith. Sent him a link. Hello, everyone. Mr. Jones. Trying to find to see if he got the link on his email. Oh, at the stage. Great. Hey.
Hello.
Getting better. I still couldn't. I've just said on the other channel that people must follow this link. Maybe I'm just going to go there quickly. Just give me a sec and we can roll. Just go YouTube. Okay. Just want to see what it looks like. It's on YouTube. My channel. View your channel. Okay, so there's one person watching. Okay, this one I'm just going to make a note here. Yeah, just going to edit video. I'm just going to say, please, I can't see what's going on the screen, but please follow new live stream STREAM save. Okay, we kill YouTube, right? And we're in StreamYard. Okay, cool. How are you doing, Keith?
I'm fine. Thank you again for having me. I'm always happy to have these conversations with you about the music that we love and discuss with other people who are interested in this stuff. And always happy to join you. So I'm fine.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just hope that other people find this link, because I'm still battling with StreamYard and I'm such a geek. But anyway, so before kind of start, let's just your week was good. I know you've been working hard, and thanks for making the time. You know you've been editing and working your backside off.
Yeah, it's been a busy week. And last night I was out at a big opening of the Kafkaesque exhibition here in Prague, which was curated by my very good friend Otto Urban, who is one of the main characters in my film Vinyl Generation. And it was great to see a lot of people from the music community out at the event, like ranging from really underground electronic artists like Monika Nacheva to old school rockers like my friend Hansa Makacek, who's also in Vinyl Generation. But also I saw Simon Vichkov, the head of the Czech Philharmonic. So it was a pretty wonderful and strange and great evening to welcome in the Franz Kafka centenary in Prague, which is a big cultural event that's going on this year. It's actually the centenary of Kafka's death, not his birth, but he's one of the universal icons that's associated with our city and its culture. So it was a very nice event, and there were two concerts. There was Argon Orchestra playing Philip Glass's piece Metamorphosis, and also Monika Nacheva doing a sort of improvised reading from Kafka texts to loops and more experimental electronic music. So it was a great evening. The music was great, the mood was great, and it was a nice way to sort of end my working week. Today I've also been very busy organizing stuff, but I'm happy to speak about some records with you. And I guess we'll speak mostly about the Flames today.
Yeah, absolutely. Just going to finish the cigarettes and pour myself a little drink and calm down because just the stress. But what I wanted to say was just getting back to Prague because the Flame thing is going to be it's really going to be good because had a great chat with my daughter this evening about that, about the 2 concerts that she's been to. Showed her the record, which we'll show later. But what I just want to sort of divert for a minute while I just kind of calm
What
down and
got her into? I mean, I know that I was at one of them with her, which was the Steve Fattar concert in the Cape Flats, which was amazing.
yes,
So,
there's one. That's the story tonight that you and she's playing guitar right now. I'm going to get there. So, but first of all, let's just talk about so the concert last night. Small venue, like this one you showed me. Large venue, a lot of people.
what the concert I was at? It was actually
Yeah.
just. It was part of the opening at the Docs Gallery in Prague, and Docs DOX Gallery is probably the largest private contemporary arts space in the city of Prague in Czech Republic, where I live. And my friend Otto Orban, who is one of the main characters of my film Vinyl Generation, for whom this stream is partly named in tribute, is the chief curator there. So it's a very familial place for me, but it's a large former industrial space in the Holešovice district of Prague 7, near to where I live. And it's just sort of a cultural hub, which is large enough to also host screenings and concerts. So as part of this opening of this centenary Franz Kafka exhibition, which my friend curated, he also asked other friends of ours who are friends of mine as well. The Agon Orchestra, which is the leading sort of chamber orchestra in Prague for the last 40 years, really performing late 20th and early 21st century European classical music, dating back to when that they actually performed their first concerts illegally under communism. They did famously concerts of Steve Reich and Philip Glass and New York minimalists as illegal gatherings under communism, and then turned into a new music ensemble in the 1990s that's for a long time had cooperation with the official institutions, with the National Theatre, with the State Opera. And so Prague is one of the few places where all of the Philip Glass operas have been performed, and it's because of their work. So they were also performing Philip Glass and his work Metamorphosis, which is connected with Franz Kafka. And Monika Natrova, who's a legendary Czech electronic, very alternative artist, dating back for the last 30 years, did a sort of cabaret performance, which was based around violin loops and a laptop DJ, and she was reading in an improvised way texts from Franz Kafka's works, both in Czech and in the original German. So the concerts were great, but that was just part of the social evening, and it was wonderful to see a lot of friends there, and virtually everybody who, or let's say 2/3 of the characters who appear in my film Vinyl Generation were all there. So it was great to see them all in one room, reconnect with them, and it was just a nice mood. I felt like I was among my peers, and it was a nice evening to sort of get the cultural year started, because it's just creeping into spring now. It's starting to warm up. We're getting out of the winter weather into warmer days when people are happier to be outside. So yeah, it was great. It was all a lot of fun.
Pretty cool. So what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to grab the record. It's like when we pitched that film, which we've been self-funding, and hopefully Mr. Keith Richards will eventually, after touring, agree to that. So, and I'm going to let you do a little bit of talking, but this was the first ever quadraphonic record recorded or released in the United States, to my knowledge. This is the South African press. In the States, it was called The Flame. You can speak a little bit about this, but you know what this is.
Of course, that is the legendary record that the Flames made in Los Angeles after they were discovered in London by members of the Beach Boys and taken in this fairy tale story to LA. And that what you see on the cover of that record is the members of the Flames at that time on the roof of Brian Wilson's house. That record is credited as being produced by Carl Wilson, But as you and I know, Stefan, basically the members of the Flames produced it themselves, and it was Carl Wilson was sort of an executive producer because he was in fact the one who invited the Flames to go to Beverly Hills and to make that record and to be part of Brother Records, the record company that the Beach Boys themselves set up to release their own records when they would get out of their contract with Capitol at the time. And so the Flames, that record that you have there, was actually the first record to come out as an issue on Brother Records, because at that time the Beach Boys themselves had
stateside.
What's that?
I mean, it came out in Brother, but it was distributed by Stateside, and they went bankrupt, and that's why the whole thing went belly up.
Yeah, the distribution was badly sorted out by Brother Records in the first place, but part of the whole reason that came together was that when the Flames, who were for those who listening who don't know, the Flames are the legendary South African band who were mainly a soul band. They performed covers primarily of American soul and R&B songs, but in a very distinctive and a very South African sort of harmonies, which were based in their Cape Malay upbringing. These guys were of Cape Malay origin. They were mixed race.
Although from Durban, yeah.
Yeah, well, the Flames themselves were from Durban, but their family was actually originally from Cape Town, where their grandfather had been an imam in the mosque. The point that I'm trying to get to is that their vocal harmonies were shaped by the specific Cape Malay vocal tradition of male choirs, which is really unique and really specific to carnival culture in South Africa that's rooted in the deep slave experience, which goes back centuries, which goes back into Dutch colonialism and why people from Malaysia and Indonesia ended up in Cape Town in the 17th century. And somehow elements of Are you still hearing me? The frame is frozen.
I hear you. Yeah. I hear
anyway,
you. Yeah.
The visual is frozen for me, but the specific vocal and choral style that was part of that community is something that is unique to South Africa, and it's also something that very much frames the vocal harmonies within the family band that the Flames had. So even though they were performing songs that they were associated with Otis Redding or whoever, American soul artists, they had this very distinctive South African flavor in the vocals and were a British style beat group, a rock group in terms of the rhythm section under them. So as you and I both know why we were so fascinated with this band, the band had a really unique sound, which is totally unique to South Africa. It's very local music, but it also had the potential to be internationally huge for various reasons, some of which are political, some of which are racial, some of which are just bad business decisions, some of which are around the poison that surrounds the Beach Boys and all their operations to this day. The band never made it. So they're an undiscovered, sort of unknown band, but real legends of 60s soul music culture.
I'm just typing something there to 480. Just want to see this, just saying if the typing's not right. But both McCartney and Johnny Greenwood from Radiohead have name checked this album in. But obviously, the South African press is not the quadraphonic. And it says here, produced by Carl Wilson, engineer was Steve Desma. Yeah, we can go into that. Actually, I've been in touch recently with Alan Boyd, brother, again, which is good. Photo and art direction, Robert Jenkins. Cover design by Dan Quest Studio in Nashville. An original brother recording. I was just going to add to that, Keith, that for me, what is interesting, because I spent a lot of time around Steve in the 90s, is, and then having met and connected later and spending so much time with, on and off with people in and around him, and the family until he passed. Sure, was it just before the pandemic? I was at Mona's.
It was 2020. It was literally just before the pandemic.
Yeah, I was at the Cradle of Mankind. But for me, what was interesting is, and also with all the Australian connections and Ricky having worked with bands like from Crowded House and the Family being there, etc., and his time in Australia is um, that whole Durban thing was there, but I mean, we know all the clubs and how they tour here, and we've spoken to people like Lana and all of that. Is um, and I'm just kind of taking it back a little bit because they certainly were a Muslim, not Indian, but of Malay, which is not actually Malay because they came from Java. It's actually Indonesia where I worked, and that's been my whole quest.
Yeah, those
Um,
people are
but
those people are ethnically Malays, but it's not Malaysia. It's contemporary Indonesia. But
exactly, I mean,
all of those
that's
colonial boundaries were invented by European powers, and the
exactly. Sheikh Yusuf and the crop. Because when I was working in shooting that other film in Java, and I started talking to the young director of the film. We traveled up to shoot that series, and he started talking to me about, because a lot of the Indonesian folks, all of our drivers would sell boats and they'd sell boats and stuff, and they'd all come past here, and they all knew about Sheikh Yusuf and the Kramats. And what for me was interesting is that you had a Cape Malay family that was in the midst of Durban, which is more of a Muslim Indian population, but the Fatah family were of Cape, so-called Malay, but Cape
look,
Java descent.
the family ended up in Durban because their father was working there and was from there. But the mother, Fatima, of all the Fatar family, was from a very deep lineage of the sort of Cape Malay real aristocracy in District 6. And their grandfather, the guys in the band, their grandfather, Fatima's father, had been an imam at the mosque in District 6. District 6 was a mixed race, sort of highly cultured neighborhood in Cape Town that was destroyed later on by the apartheid regime in South Africa. And both in Cape Town and in Durban, the family were very directly impacted on a very familial level by the Group Areas Act, which prohibited where they could live, where they could go to school, who they could interact with. And all of these social factors really influenced the direction of where the Flames went as a band, where their music went into. It's really inseparable for them. The Flames were gifted as a band, the three brothers in the band were gifted their instruments to form the band as young teenagers because their neighbors were forced to move and to go into integration because the neighborhood that they were living in Durban was reclassified racially. And so the neighbors emigrated and left behind a whole set of electric music instruments, including amplifiers, which became the impulse for them to start playing rock music or beat music. Even
Yeah,
though the whole family was musical in the first place. But the unique set of influences that created this band were both cultural and in some way political, and are really all connected with this Cape Malay identity. I think that's inseparable from talking about the Flames, and not just in terms of identity politics, but I think culturally the influences that come from that Western Cape, Cape Malay, Cape Colored, whatever you want to call it, that culture is very present in the music.
40 was talking about some Gil Scott. That's Inner City Blues. 40, I've got that. I'm just going to highlight that comment. Keith, I just want to make a bit of a disclaimer here, because it's even within my own family and whatever. We all know that history is an interpretation. So we've both met Steve and us. We spent time around him. We've met Blondie. I've met him twice. You've spent some time around him without me. I've spent some time with Ricky. We obviously never met the late brother. I mean, that's another story. Whatever. But I am going to make a bit of a disclaimer, here, that obviously certain people will watch this and say, oh, you know, the interpretation is different or whatever. It's like with my family. My sister or my brother might have a different interpretation of our family history than I have. Just a disclaimer is that we've done this pure film and documentary research, have engaged with amazing people. We're doing a couple of Murray's there. He's my great mate, filmmaker from Nepal, but back in the UK. Hey Murray, welcome to the show. But you know, I just want to make that disclaimer because, you know, it's the same as, like, you know, what happened with that Rodriguez documentary, you know, about the mistruths and certain things, you know, and we're not complete with this film yet. And certain people, you know, I mean, you know, we've spoken to people like Rafsan Rashid, a couple of people, you know, we're just kind of keeping it low key right now because this has been an absolute.
Well, I'm not speaking about any film that doesn't exist yet. We are working on a film for many years about trying to document and show the history of the Flames, but that's barely into the public light. I'm not speaking about that. I was only speaking about the distant past with the history of the family, which is a matter of record.
My disclaimer is on our research because, you know, people are so easy to hit at you on your research. This is incorrect. You know, you didn't connect this dot. You didn't connect this I. This is what we always find. And I certainly know that you and I have done the best globally to connect with as many people as we can, and through us, you know, multiple countries, to actually try and get this thing going. That's all I'm saying, is because there's been a thing lately where people come at you and say, "Oh, your research is incorrect," or this is wrong, or that's wrong, you know. And I'm part of that, you know.
Nobody has ever come at me and said my research was wrong, because I make a point of being very moral and very ethical in any project that I'm involved with, giving credit where it's due, footnoting everything from where it came from. And all of my films, all of my writing, all of my projects, all the work I do as an academic teaching, I'm very transparent and very obvious about where my research comes from. So I haven't had those criticisms, and it's I don't want to say it's not our problem. It's not our problem yet. If somebody wants to issue criticisms later when there's a film actually made, that's a different thing. But we're not there yet. That's I don't know if this is the time or place for that conversation.
No, absolutely. You know, yeah. Just somebody came at me last week around some research stuff, and
okay, I'm sorry to hear that, but it's I wouldn't say anything publicly or on a stream like this that I didn't feel was legitimate or couldn't be backed up. If I'm expressing my opinions, I will say that. Nothing I've said about the history of the
you write liner notes. Like within the vinyl community, there is not anybody that's come up on screen around having written liner notes, and especially for a label like Light in the Attic, you know, which is for me, one of the most praiseworthy labels in terms of what they've done. You know, Matsuli also, where they're going right now, you know, just you don't work with the riffraff. You know what I mean? This is like it's serious stuff. You work in a university, and what I'm saying is, you know, this is more. I like our sort of back and forth to be like, we do the best to try and bring you stories of the vinyl generation. If you know what I mean?
Sure. Anything I will say on the stream is going to be a direct quote from things that I actually shot, or conversations that I actually had, and people that I actually met. Like I would not be interested in just offering opinions about the band like the Flames that I on my own behalf. It's not my story. It's not my place to interject my own opinions into their narrative. So everything I will say going forward in this will be a pure quotation from one of the members of that band, you know, most of whom I have met and several of whom I've interviewed, and lots of people around them. I wouldn't get involved with that project if I didn't think it was a hugely important story that was remaining untold and unknown by lots of people around the world. As all the films I do, they They sort of organically come to me, but I wouldn't put so much time and effort into doing them in that way if it wasn't an important story that needed to be told in the first place.
I'm just looking at 40's comment. Yeah, he says he's Pal Sally Exeter NGO workaround. 40 is welcome anytime. You know, anybody who's been in Cape Town or whatever. You know, I mean, you're also quite a bit of an academic, so welcome anytime. So Keith, I was actually I'm just going to take a side thing because I mean we shared a crazy experience. So obviously we know that that Blondie Chaplin joined the Flames back then, you know, in South Africa, was in a band called the Wild Things, correct?
Sure, that's right. And even before that,
who was the drummer? Remember we went to this. It was Joe Finn.
Joe Finn. Blondie is part of Blondie Chaplin, who was eventually the lead singer of the Flames, not the original lead singer, but he's the lead singer on that record that you were holding up, and on their big hit "For Your Precious Love." He is part of this extended family, let's call them, of the Finns, who are all descendants of this character Benjamin Zephaniah Finn, who was the original translator between the British Crown and the Zulu Kingdom in the mid-19th century, the time of Shaka Zulu. And so the original Finn was granted special privileges by Shaka Zulu, then the Zulu king, which continued on all through the 19th century in the city of Durban, where this sort of what we would now call mixed race community of descendants of this original translator, who was a Scottish guy who had moved to Africa to get involved in the ivory trade, ended up as a translator for Shaka Zulu, living in Durban, later switched sides and became the British translator for their side. But he was just this sort of colonialist founder of this very large extended family of people who are hugely influential in the mixed race South African culture until now. So both Blondie Chaplin from the Flames and this other guy, Joe Finn, who was his cousin, this drummer from the Wild Things, and another band called the Kittens, which even preceded that. The Kittens never recorded. The Wild Things are better known because they recorded a 7-inch record for Atlantic Records. And they're sort of more a matter of musical history in 1960s South African musical culture. But the Kittens was the band that grew out of, which was Joe Finn's original thing. Again, I know all this because we went and spoke to Joe Finn at his Muslim community center where he was giving music lessons for children in the Cape Flats. And we heard all this directly from him. He doesn't like to talk to the media. He doesn't want to publicize his own story, so he won't be part of our film. But we heard this directly from him, the origin of these bands and how they developed. And it's amazing that the Wild Things were signed to Atlantic Records, which was the same time that they did the Percy Sledge Live in South Africa record, which is one of these best-selling, enormously influential records in South Africa, in the same way that Rodriguez is. I think every household I've ever been in South Africa had a copy of the Percy Sledge Live in South Africa record. I have a copy of it here somewhere.
I've got a copy too. So I wanted to interject, and the reason I mentioned Joe is there's a South African article Facebook group run by a great guy, Mark Vass. He's a kind of metalhead, but he worked in bars and stuff in Rocky Street back in the day. He's been abroad for many years. He's probably got the most complete collection of South African records in the world that I know of. And he posted a thing on his South African archival Facebook page the other day where something about the best South African bands or whatever of all times. And Joe Finn got on there and posted the Wild Things. And obviously Mark's got it, he would know. But I mean, I think I've been out of touch with Joe since before the pandemic. I mean, he did not want to go on camera. We know that he has his own feelings about what happened, you know, between when Blondie left the Wild Things for the Flames, and, you know, Ricky was on drums, whereas he was the drummer with the Wild Things. You know, this is what happens with drummers, you know. But I just posted back and I said, Joe, it's been a long time, you know, we need to chat. because he's another person that I remember that day when we went into Athlone, and we got to the community center with Gary and that, and he was like, and Rafsik put us onto it, but it was like, put down your cameras, I'm not doing any interview, and he was like, Alex, and we're like, okay, just let's talk. And he was just a cool dude, but he has his own interpretation of his history. Where he was, like you said, they were signed to Atlantic Records.
Sure.
There's so
Like
much South Africa that is just.
The Wild Things were also an important band, or they wouldn't have been signed to Atlantic Records. And the Invaders were also a major band at that time, as were many others. Why the Flames rose to the top of all these beat groups in the mixed race or so-called colored community of South Africa in the 1960s is because they were something special. There was something unique about the Flames, but all these other bands are enormously interesting. I think that's and those records can be had, as we know, in South African record shops. If you go digging through 7-inch records, you'll find lots of stuff from the Invaders, and that Wild Things record on Atlantic Records I've never seen personally, so that's probably a rarity. But the
Invaders no go anymore. You can't find it.
Well, it used to be, and I remember that's how I came across the Invaders the first time, was just finding the records out digging in Johannesburg. And of course, I'd never heard of them, but I recognized the songs because most of these were cover bands. That was the nature of the music business that they were operating in. And only later did the Flames start to write their own material and move away from that. But they also came from this background of being entertainers, of being a show band, basically. It's what they were. They were at the same time as beat groups in England, like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Animals and so on, who were also all cover bands when they started as well. All of those bands were also playing American R&B and soul covers when they started out for several years. And the Flames were just a contemporary of them. In the same way that I always say, I worked with National Wake on that reissue on Light in the Attic, and people constantly will compare National Wake to the Specials or to the Clash in a way that they're trying to frame National Wake that they were influenced by these British bands. But I always say it was not like that at all. National Wake are a contemporary of those bands. They were doing the same thing at the same time, but they were doing it in South Africa, which means they were behind a wall of censorship and barely in touch with the outside world. That's why these bands weren't known into the broader context. What the Flames were doing in 1962, 1963 is no different than what the Beatles or the Rolling Stones were doing. Not exactly the same, obviously, but they were essentially taking the same raw materials, which was Motown and Arthur Alexander and Fats Domino and American R&B of the late 50s, a few years later reshaping it into this 4-piece rock band format. And the Flames were doing that also from 1962 onwards.
Okay.
Probably the Wild Things, whatever also.
I'm going to digress for a minute and then I'm going to throw something back at you. I'll do it afterwards. I'm going to throw something to you. So let's talk about For Your Precious Love and Who Wrote It and your story around that.
Okay, what would you like to ask me?
The audience wants to know. Talk about that song and who wrote it, and it's there was well, especially the second version, which was on what, Burning Soul or Soulfire.
I have it. I have Soulfire here. That's
very much shelves.
Which song are we talking about? This is Soulfire, by the way. For me, this is the best.
For Your Precious Love.
For Your Precious Love. Okay, that's on this record. For me, this is this is the penultimate or not the penultimate. It's the most important and most legendary of the albums that the Flames did in South Africa. I said penultimate, sort of giving distance to that record that they did in Los Angeles, but that's a slightly different thing. The song For Your Precious Love is actually originally written by Jerry Butler from the Impressions. And okay, give me a second. I'll be right back because I have a copy of that. I actually was trying for a long time to get access to Jerry Butler, who is still alive, and unfortunately he's not in physical shape to do interviews according to his family. But I really went deep down the road of trying to find this guy because I think the story is so important. So I'll be back with my Impressions record in a second.
All right, I'm just gonna have to entertain. The next part is it's interesting that this record was bought in we'll talk about it afterwards, in Bulawayo in Rhodesia, what is then Rhodesia, not Zimbabwe at that time. And the Flames played after just before they split up and came back from the States. I'm just interjecting to another story and then we'll get to it. They played one of the last concerts they played was at a stadium in what was then Rhodesia.
They played with
Salisbury Dam Stadium. Yeah, and they played with a band called Suck, who people have cited. I mean, it's one of the rarest South African records ever, who've covered Black Sabbath and all of that. The Suck album as well is like one of the rarest South African albums to find. And we've got the nerves that were kindly given to us, and they will be whatever that are sitting here of Suck. Well, that concert where Suck played and the Flame played at Glam Stadium in Salisbury. It was, I think, 1971. And there is a picture of the late Ian Smith's late son with a bowler hat, and he was apparently tripping out of his head on LSD. That's another story. I'm going to let Keith carry on about Mr. Butler.
Yeah, no, that's true. That the one of the pretty much the last concert, as far as I know, of the Flames that was done in Africa anywhere was that concert in the then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in Bulawayo, with Suck and with Otis Waygood Blues Band, who were a local Rhodesian at the time band. And all of these bands ended up having a very lasting influence in alternative music culture in Southern Africa. So all of that stuff are sort of the roots of what I was looking at with my film Punk in Africa. Both Suck and the Flames always came up in virtually every conversation of anyone from that generation who grew up in the 70s. Much more than Rodriguez, actually, despite the prevailing narratives. But to get back to Jerry Butler wrote the original version of For Your Precious Love and recorded it with the Impressions. It is on this record. This is my base. This is basically a best of the Impressions with Jerry Butler. I also have the best of the Impressions with Curtis Mayfield, which is essentially the same, but also produced, and most of the songs written by Jerry Butler, but he was moving himself away from performing. But his version of For Your Precious Love, you see, it's the second biggest hits of the Jerry Butler era of the Impressions. So that's Chicago soul, early 60s. That was an obscure record. It later became a hit in different versions by Oscar Tony Jr., by Otis Redding, it became sort of a R&B standard over the course of the 60s. But the Flames knew it because Brother Fattar, who was the bassist in the Flames, was an avid record collector. He was a collector of 7-inch records, as Stefan and I know from doing our research with the family as a young man. And he would go to the port in Durban and buy 7-inch records from American sailors at a time. And this is the early 60s. So this stuff was absolutely not available in South Africa in stores and in the apartheid era record industry within the country. So this very informal way of record trading with sailors was usually important for all of these bands in Durban that we were talking about to develop their repertoire and have new songs and new ideas and new arrangements that they would learn from the 7-inch basically jukebox 45s. At the same time, this was going on in Jamaica with the development of ska music and early Jamaican pop music, where records from New Orleans and coming across the water from sailors underground, not what was available in the shops, certainly not what was being played on the JVC. This stuff had a huge currency and fed into the development of local music. Very similar thing was happening at the same time in Durban, and the Flames are a prime example of that. So they took their version, their arrangement, their vocal arrangement of For Your Precious Love from the Jerry Butler version, not from later versions which became better known elsewhere later on. And if you compare all the versions, you'll hear that both the Flames cover and the Rolling Stones cover of For Your Precious Love both derive directly. Their DNA comes directly out of the Jerry Butler version with the Impressions, which is a more obscure record. That's this version. By the way, I bought this for $5 in Washington D.C. in a church basement. Washington D.C. is one of the best places in the world to buy old school African American music, especially if you get out of the official record stores and into barbershops and churches and places that sell records on the side. Man, like the amount of old soul records that I've found in places like that is incredible. This is a similar thing. Another amazing, beautiful record, which is
What label is that on? Actually, I'm just interested. I mean, I'm not geeking it out tonight because we want the show to be different. But you know me, I've always got that sort of. There's the dead wax kind of thing in me.
This is Paramount with the Curtis Mayfield version of Impressions of Paramount, which is an ABC affiliated label.
American, obviously, in the US press.
Yeah, these are all US presses. So yeah,
I'm not going to ask you if it's an original. Yeah, that's later, but it's great. Well, it's hits obviously, but yeah, ABC, I'm going to get past.
It's Paramount Records, which was an ABC subsidiary. It was a part of that record.
Yeah. I'm loving this. I'd actually forgotten about Brother, and when we were told how he would go down and get those records from the docks.
Yeah, he would get a bit like from African American sailors who were not even allowed to go into South African territory, but they could circulate around the port areas, which were an international zone. And I'm sure it was similar in Cape Town. I have become friends in recent years with this guy Alvin Christie, who was the rhythm guitarist in the UK reggae band in the late 70s called Dambala, which was heavily involved with the UK punk scene and rock against racism and that whole movement. And they did an amazing song called Zimbabwe. We're going to crucify Smith and take back Zimbabwe. That's a really rare 12-inch, which is a great record, which is worth seeking out. I have a copy somewhere, but I don't know exactly where it is, so I won't look for it now. But Alvin told me that when he was in the Royal Navy in the late 60s, and they went to Cape Town, they were met at the docks by local people, and everyone had to wait on the ship, and the few black guys from the ship had to be taken, or anyone who was recognized as non-white under South African law at the time, were taken off the ship, and there would be a flatbed truck waiting to take these guys to District 6. Then all the white boys were allowed off the ship to go into the Cape Town harbor. And at the time, he said this felt like a punishment, like they were being held to these awful oppressive racial laws of the South African system at the time, which of course is true. But in retrospect, now he can see that by being taken directly into District 6 by local people, they had a much better time and heard much better music, ate much better food, had a much more rewarding experience anyway, just by being mainlined into this. And so I'm sure that what Brother Fattar was encountering, dealing with these sailors, was very similar. That these guys were also curious. They wanted to figure out what's going on in Africa. They knew what the situation is in South Africa, how rotten and how terrible the government was. They were probably thrilled to meet local people, even kids like Brother Fattar. So that exchange worked in both ways. I'm certain of it.
I've just got an amazing parallel to that because, and you know, because you're more of a storyteller. I'm sort of the kind of producer that's always been behind the research and that. But you also tell the story about the Flames, you know, and how they left, and what happened to them when they got on that boat and landed up in the UK. You know, I want you to talk a little bit about that. That's just such an amazing, yeah, and what happened with the Musicians Union.
Okay, sure. And by the way, I see that people are posting comments here. If any comment comes up to what I'm saying, Stefan, while I'm speaking, just relay it to me.
Yeah, I'm just checking the log. I don't know if this is
comments at the same time. So help me out with that.
Yeah,
because the comments are all very interesting.
Absolutely, but I'm just seeing why we don't have private chat here. Oh, comments, banners. Okay, so there's private chat. Okay, comments. Let's just renew that. Good chat. The last comment I've got is you got it, Murray. Yeah.
No, I didn't mean that. As I'm speaking about telling these stories, because I'll go into the story.
Absolutely, because this is just such an amazing story.
What happened with the Flames? Okay, is the Flames put out this record, Soulfire, which was their actual hit record in South Africa.
Show that photo. I mean, it's yeah.
And these costumes that they're wearing, these matching suits, these kaftans, were sewn by Fatima, the mother of the Fattar brothers, and which Blondie Chaplin told in an interview that she is the one who designed this look for them, which is sort of Indian, which is deriving influence from what was going on in Durban, where they grew up, but it also was reflective of an interest in Indian spirituality and culture, in rock music and in psychedelic culture at the time anyway. This is 1967, 68 when they're recording this stuff. So even that photograph tells a whole story of its own. The stuff that the Flames were into, how they were growing, how they were developing. This record hit big in South Africa in a huge way. For Your Precious Love, the Jerry Butler composition that I was just speaking about, became a #1 hit all over Southern Africa, in Rhodesia, in then Portuguese East Africa, now Mozambique, in all of these countries. For Your Precious Love was a #1 song for week after week, for months in 1968. It was a huge hit. And for the first time, the Flames started to cross over into the white teenage market in South Africa. Up to this time, they'd been perfectly allowed to do their thing by the regime because it wasn't threatening anyone. What the Flames were doing wasn't particularly political. They were a dance band playing cover songs, and they were really playing for an audience that was within their own racial classification. When this record came out, Soulfire, For Your Precious Love, that became so huge, so popular, that it transcended every racial group. And until now, the Flames are one of the few things that you can find that really has an active following within every racial group, every ethnic group, every language group, everything within South Africa. It's that's one of the things that attracted me to them, that they really transcend every culture within this very multicultural society, which was formerly kept apart from each other. The Flames transcended all of that. However, when they started to do that, which was primarily on the strength of that single, For Your Precious Love, and this album, they started to attract too much attention from the authorities. They get hassled by the police, hassled by the promoters, hassled by the radio people. They really encountered much more resistance for the first time than what they were used to. And so they decided to get out of there. And they had enough money to do it on their own terms. They had bought all their own equipment. They were a totally DIY operation. They were able to take their own amps, their own guitars, all their own stuff, and just leave the country. However, they did this in a naive way where they thought they would be welcomed with open arms going to the UK, which for them was the center of pop music at the time, with Carnaby Street and Swinging London, and all of that myth was heavily promoted in South Africa in the English language media. So they knew about it, and they had encountered people from that culture, like James Fox, who later became the ghostwriter of Keith Richards' autobiography Life. But one of his earliest byline pieces was for Drum Magazine about the Flames in South Africa in 1968. I was fortunate enough to get to interview him about that. He still remembered the Flames after more than 50 years as one of the best live bands he ever saw in South Africa and then again in London. So they were hearing this feedback from people who were part of that scene. They thought they could really make it in London. What they found
James
was
Fox,
that
he was also involved in the film White Mischief. He spent time in Kenya.
well, he wrote the book White Mischief, on which the film is based, and he spent time in Kenya in the 1960s at the same time that he was working for the Bailey family in South Africa. It was all connected. He was working for the Kenya Daily News, the Rand Daily Mail, and Drum Magazine as a freelance journalist, or young sort of trainee journalist. All of those stories will be in the eventual film that comes out. But he really was someone who encountered the Flames, coming straight from that swinging London culture, and being a friend of David Bailey and Penelope Tree and Michael Caine and all these people. And he ended up in Johannesburg working on the Rand Daily Mail, also doing stuff in Kenya, and discovered the Flames and immediately saw how great it was. But the Flames were also learning from people like that, who from the outside world, who saw their talents and saw what they were capable of. So they decided to emigrate. Where the naivete and not understanding the global situation came in was that they didn't have work permits sorted out. So when they arrived at Southampton at the docks, they were blocked from entry to the UK. This was right after the time of the Enoch Powell Rivers of Blood speech about how immigrants are going to cause this fissure within society. And Enoch Powell said, like the Roman, I see the river overflowing with much blood. This classical illusion, and that's the whole political moments that they arrived in the UK for them was unfortunately very reminiscent of South Africa. It was very racialized. It was very xenophobic, and they didn't have permission.
Wasn't there the Asian immigration crisis going on? Yeah, right.
It was the start. It was the same time. They unfortunately were part of the beginning of that. They arrived in 1969, right after the unfortunate Enoch Powell speech. The big Asian immigration from East Africa came a little bit later with Idi Amin, but it was all part of the same historical moment. The Flames just found themselves in the middle of that without realizing that that's what they were getting into. So they were kept actually on the ship for a week.
This is the best part.
While they tried to clear their papers, and for them, they were leaving South Africa because they were, as a rock band, it was inconvenient for that they could be playing as a non-white band to a white audience. When they got to the UK, they were able to get in because the Musicians Union made an exception for them that they were black South Africans, and therefore they should be treated with special care and special awareness. So
that took 2 weeks, I think, for the
yeah,
Musicians Union.
This racial identification that none of them in the band really identified with, either in South Africa or in the UK, continued to haunt them, I think, even in the US. That, like, people never knew how to market them because they were so racially ambiguous, and because they were mixing rock and soul music at a time when it was, those were still racially codified categories. But they entered into this stuff in the UK, really, they didn't know what they were getting into, and it was deeply unpleasant as a welcome to the Western world. They finally got out of South Africa, and they're immediately dealing with racial categories and immigration quotas, and having to deal with a union that people they didn't even know, really. Eventually, they did get in. They did become hugely successful as a club band playing in London in two places, in the Revolution, and what was the other club? They were He's too clumsy.
Blay.
Blazes.
Oh, God.
Blazes.
I mean, there's
Blazes.
rumors of Hendrix being there.
Everyone played there, and everyone went there. And Steve Fattar told me that at Flames gigs at the Revolution, he saw John Lennon and Yoko Ono. He saw Joe Cocker, all the members of the Hollies, all of these guys. I learned from James Fox that Keith Richards tried to go and see the Flames at one of these gigs, but he never made it. He ended up in some other party. But the awareness of the Flames and what they were doing was very high among these people, among cultural, swinging London 60s rockers. They were the hot band for a couple of months. That's how the Beach Boys discovered them. It was actually Al Jardine from the Beach Boys who, the guitarist of the original formation of the Beach Boys.
Well, look, Carl was the one who flew over from Paris, correct?
No, what actually I can tell you exactly what happened because I was able to interview Al Jardine.
Well, we've got. I mean, that interview was amazing. I mean, just that we've got it. I mean, he's such a wonderful human being. You know.
What happened was that the Beach Boys in 1969 were on a tour of Europe playing theaters. They were trying to grow up as a band at that time. The Beach Boys in 1969 were at sort of a crossroads. Brian Wilson didn't want to tour with them anymore, but was still writing and arranging the material. But the band didn't want to just do their classic hit material from a few years earlier. They were trying to grow up and do more adult stuff. You know, even though they had the name Boys in their band, they were trying to be men basically. And so they did this European tour in 1969, in the early part of the year, where they were playing theaters rather than like dance halls or wherever they played on previous European tours. They were one level up.
Keith dropped out. He's going to come back. We're just going to wait. This happens from time to time. I'm also going to check my net. I'm off 4G here. But we roll. No, on 2 bars. It's good. It's happened that on our first one, just hang on. Sometimes it does get. He's back. Yep. At the stage.
No,
you went. You were off.
Beach Boys were on the
You disappeared for a while, Keith. You went off screen.
I know.
I'm
starting my story again. The Beach Boys were on this tour in 1969, playing theaters rather than just dance halls or teeny bopper stuff because they were trying to develop a more adult image. They also played in Prague at Lucerna, a famous music venue in the center of Prague where Louis Armstrong played in 1965 and where I actually used to work years later. But in 1969, the Beach Boys famously played here as well, and one of the few Western bands to come here after the invasion in 1968, and which they famously denounced from the stage. They gave shout-outs to Alexander Dubček and to the Czech resistance against the Soviet occupation. It was on this same tour where they also played at the Olympia in Paris. They played at one of the Odeons in London. So it was in 1969. After the show, what Al Jardine told me was that because, I mean, he was in the Beach Boys, he was a celebrity, so he was able to ask the minders that were looking after them, where should I go? Where should I go and hang out to have a night on the town? I want to go to Carnaby Street. I want to see clubs. And they said, go to Blazes. And he went to Blazes and he saw the Flames on stage for a whole set, having no idea who they were, anything about them, had no context. And as he told it to me, for him, they struck him as a South African version of the Beatles. That they had the same basic arrangement with the guitar and the bass guitar, vocal harmonies, sophisticated way of doing R&B songs that really reminded him of the Beatles, and in his opinion, equally as good musically, just not doing their own material. But he was incredibly struck by this band. So the next night, after the Beach Boys played again, they were playing there for a week at this Hammersmith Odeon. He said to Carl Wilson, who was really the prime mover within Brother Records at that time, you have to come check out this South African band that are playing after hours, like late, early in the evening, early in the morning, playing at Blazes, because they're an amazing band, and you really should check them out. So that's the story direct from his mouth. He discovered the Boys. He told Carl Wilson to check them out.
Yeah.
The famous photograph is with Carl Wilson signing a contract with the Flames, signing them to Brother Records, but that was a few days later. Carl Wilson went the second night after Al Jardine saw them and pushed the other guys to go. Then, as I heard from these guys directly, once they started mixing together, they realized how much they had in common. That the Beach Boys were also like three brothers and their cousin. And the Flames were three brothers and not a cousin, but someone from the same community and from the same street. It was all family related. And then they started comparing astrological signs. They saw that they matched in this way, that stuff had certain currency in the late 60s. And what Stefan is holding up, that's the result. That's the they signed to Brother Records. They went to LA. They recorded that record in Brian Wilson's house under the auspices of Carl Wilson. And now we speak about the Flames not in terms of their South African history or these wonderful records that they did at the time, but through their connection with the Beach Boys, which grew deeper over time. And two members of the Flames, Ricky Fattar and Blondie Chaplin, then later ended up being members of the Beach Boys, also writing songs for the Beach Boys, being lead vocalists for the Beach Boys on certain tracks, and heavily involved with the early 70s sort of later version of the Beach Boys. It's sort of a hybrid band with the Flames, really.
It's quite amazing because there's so much Beatles stuff going on right now, and everybody was like, what was the next most Beatlesque album, etc. This, that. I mean, we know from people we've spoken to, I'm not going to mention names here, that have crossed the paths of Linda McCartney and all that Paul was into this album. It's been definitely on that show, Name Checked by Johnny Green from Radiohead. It's, and we haven't even spoken about the unreleased songs, right? And I mean, that was Primal Scream before Primal Scream. I always say that one track. And the battle, to get this out, if it'll ever come out, those tracks. But it like anybody who listens to this album, it's like, God, I only had the files for years, like still like, Lady, Don't Worry, Bill, Get Your Mind Made Up. And it's actually ironic that eventually that Ricky, beyond, then they did Holland with the Beach Boys, and that's another whole episode. We know that. But beyond that he eventually became part of the Ruttles. And Steve's comment was because
I'll follow up on that just in terms of the songwriting. But I wanted to give a shout out to this comment from 4D Man about Sam Selvon's novel Lonely Londoners, which is predominantly known as the first novel that's written entirely in Jamaican patois. Right? Earlier than that, in some novels and some fiction, characters had spoken in Jamaican or Caribbean patois, but the authorial voice, the whole narrative voice of that novel, is written in patois, which is the first time something like that appeared in print. Not only is it beautiful prose poetry, as 4D Man says, but it is a really funny and really cutting satire about the weird ways in which British society was welcoming and also unwelcoming to many migrant communities at that time, which is the same era. The Lonely Londoners is set in the late 50s, but most of the same practices were still what the Flames were dealing with when they tried to enter the UK 10 years later. I also particularly love the Lonely Londoners because there is a character in that book who is a Nigerian, but who pretends to be a Jamaican to fit in with these guys or to have slightly better social status. And I've encountered this character so many times in my life. I've encountered this guy even in South Africa, where Nigerians will pretend to be some other ethnicity. I've encountered Nigerians who pretended to be Cuban, who pretended to be American, who pretended to be Jamaican. But this guy is perfectly nailed in Sam Sullivan's book. And he's not a bad guy. It's not a bad character. He's just a hustler. He's just trying to also deal with the cards that he's been dealt. And it's so beautiful how the book deals with these things in a humorous way, but also in a cutting way. My friend Johnny Temple from Soulside and Girls Against Boys, who I do the film with now, who runs Akashic Books in Brooklyn, in Fort Greene, has been trying to get the rights to republish The Lonely Londoners for years, and it's a book that has always remained out of his orbit. But it's something that he and I have spoken about. It's a wonderful cult book. Everyone should read that. Anyway, that's my response to the comment. To go back to the songwriting about Ricky Fataar and Blondie Chaplin, the stuff that they were contributing on that record that you held up, that Flames record, that eponymous record that they did with Carl Wilson. Themes from that sort of spill over in and certain types of songs. Like what was the? You mentioned one song in particular. It was one of the.
That typical laminate peel. I mean, kids, see the light. I mean, make it easy. Hey, Lord, lady, don't worry, Bill. Which is get your mind made up. Highs and lows. I'm so happy. Dove.
It was don't worry. Don't worry, Bill. That I was thinking of. Bill is also their internal reference to Brother Fataar, but that's the song I was thinking of, which is an early song co-written by Ricky Fataar. But if you check, this is the first Beach Boys record, Carl and the Passions, which those guys appear on.
No, I've got that.
Look at this. That's the actual Beach Boys, circa 1972. Look at these guys. You're like, that's obviously not the same Beach Boys that people remember. But there are songs on here like Hold On Dear Brother, which also is obviously directed to Brother Fataar. That's why what you said made me think of that. And there's also He Comes Down, which is a gospel song written by Al Jardine. It's weird. It's a pure gospel song, but with Krishna and Buddhist references in the lyrics instead of Christian ones. But it fits.
There's one track that ends Waza, that Zulu thing as well. That's in that album as well.
That Zulu thing is on the record you're holding. Unfortunately, there's no Zulu choruses on the Beach Boys records. But on that He Comes Down, the harmonies that Blondie and Ricky do on that pseudo gospel song written by Al Jardine to express Krishna consciousness ideas is actually, if you listen to it and you know the Flames harmony style, it's like a Flames song. There are several songs on this record that are a direct continuation from that Flames record which you were holding on. If you listen to them back to back, you'll hear it. Absolutely.
One of the most amazing things, and one of the other people in the vinyl community, and I know a person at a record company, that when we were trying to unleash recordings, and we'll get there. But that person said to me, he said it's quite amazing. He said the Beach Boys, because remember, the Beatles were British, the Stones were British. The Beach Boys were probably at a certain time and for all time in a certain way. One of the biggest bands. I want to just finish. Biggest band in America, but they were a white band. And then that whole thing with Wilson happened, and he turned around to me and said they were the biggest but widest band in America, and it took two black South Africans. We're not talking about how they were classified here, but it took two black South Africans to get them back on track. And I go back to Holland, and for me, that is still an absolute musical masterpiece.
I think all these things are masterpieces in retrospect. Just the fact that nobody knows the Flames record doesn't make it any less of a masterpiece. It died because of bad distribution, bad politics, and people didn't know how to categorize a quote unquote black band playing rock music at that time. Listening to it now, it bears comparison directly to those Beach Boys records from the same time, and those Beach Boys records are excellent in their own way. Also, both Carl and the Passions, which I was just showing, and also the Holland record, they're all excellent records. There's a certain synthesis of ideas on all those records that now maybe we are more attuned to, that we can see and understand and hear better. And I think that's why it's time is ripe to make a film dealing with those issues. How members of this obscure South African, essentially cover band at its root, ended up in as members of the Beach Boys and the Rolling Stones, which are the biggest bands in the world, aside from that other band that you mentioned. But those are the three bands, you know. Those are bands that are, and what else is at that level? Bob Dylan, Bob Marley. There's a handful of artists that are at that level, but obviously the Rolling Stones and the Beach Boys are. Even if you don't like their music, you have to recognize how important and how huge and what a massive voice these bands have. And these South African guys ended up as members of these bands for a long time. And the Ruddles, as you also mentioned, which is a fun thing, but that's a minor footnote, in fact, to how important the music of the Flames really is. That's why I think it's something that needs, it's crying out to have a film made about it.
It's quite amazing, just as we've connected the dots over the years, because kind of I think back to Pet Sounds, and I've always loved it. And then I mean, Smile. That's not a. I mean, the drama and the saga behind the Beach Boys makes a lot look. we know. I mean, I've got letters there from the late Trish Campo, and and that what was his name, Elliot, who was Carl's chauffeur, who eventually ran Brother Records, and he's out now. But it's just amazing, because like I go back to Pet Sounds now, and at times and I've got both the mono and stereo versions. I mean, some people would like to hear that, but I mean, it is just an incredibly crazy experimental album. So that was like 67. So you look at Zappa. You look at the Beatles. I think had done Revolver that year. The albums that came out in that year, that time, and actually, I think the Stones. Did they do? Was it Satanic Majesties in 67? I mean, you need to go, but that whole sort of 66, 67 era of music and what came out, and then certain things. Obviously, Dylan was doing his thing. But it's so it was between the UK and then
well,
there were guys they were getting it and listening to it. It's just incredible.
I actually would say it doesn't just have to be between the US and the UK. We have received that way of processing how we deal with music, we talk about music, because it's a formed narrative that has existed for a long time. It's existed for 50 years about music that's even older than that. And I don't think anyone at this stage is in any doubt about the magic or the influence or the special qualities of Pet Sounds, or even Smile, which was a botched record and didn't come out at the time. It only came out in the version Brian Wilson envisioned it 2 decades later. We know those things. Those things have a platform. They have an understanding. They're part of a universally understood narrative, and the Flames are not. But the Flames were in the same mix and in the same set of cultural ideas and in the same set of musical ideas at the same time, with the same people, in fact. And we're even in these bands. That's what hasn't been acknowledged. That's what hasn't been talked about. Not to take away from what you're saying. Pet Sounds is magnificent in its own right, but everyone knows that. And that's not a story that has to be proven again.
That's yeah, and that's what I'm saying is because we're involved in a project that's bringing a little bit of Africa into how people perceive the world, and that's been a lot of my battle in getting this thing started. But if I had to just throw a curveball, right, and it's not a curveball because I mean, if you had to throw a non-American, non-European 1966 thing into the mix right now for you, that's made an impact, what would that be?
Serge Gainsbourg, Bonnie and
Fuck,
Clyde,
of course.
which is also the same era, 67. But it wasn't so. It maybe didn't have such a footprint at the time in international music, but it certainly does now, especially after the advent of sampling and after people have caught up to Gainsbourg. But that's even outside of the English language. In terms of what was going on in African music in 1966, I mean, that's built that Hugh Masekela and Miriam Makeba were already in the US, but were not yet quite having hit records. But in 1968, Hugh Masekela did Grazing in the Grass, which basically until just a few years ago was the only song to have been a #1 record in the United States by an African artist. Yeah, there you go. Well, that's actually that photograph is the photograph from the Riot album, which came out in 1968.
This is a rare box, British label. I managed to get my brother one of the last of these. I mean, it's yeah, those years. I mean, it was huge. Also, and Grazing in the Grass.
At the same time, Lee Scratch Perry was getting started in Jamaica. He wasn't doing the Black Ark yet in 1966, but he was already mastering and recording records. And what is it? The People Funny Boy is 67. That's right after that. And then the Liquidator, which is still played before every Chelsea match at home in their stadium. There were lots of things going on that just fall outside of the framework of how people talk about these things, and they were treated as novelty music at the time, and didn't get taken as seriously as the Rolling Stones or the Beach Boys. But now we know better. Now we can listen to all this stuff right next to each other and compare it directly. Saying all of that doesn't mean that I'm taking anything away from the legacy of the Beach Boys or the Rolling Stones or any of these groups. I think they're all hugely important. I love all of them. I have not all of their records, but I have records by all of these bands, and I listen to it and I engage with it. But at the same time, I listen to Jamaican or South African or Zimbabwean or Iranian music from the same time, or Colombian music, or Puerto Rican music. I mean, Puerto Rican music hasn't really taken off. It's about to.
66 or 67, as controversial as it is now, where they were, and she passed. But was the year that Jacqueline Dupre married Daniel Barenbaum, and look how he's built bridges.
If you want to start moving outside of rock music, 1966 is also when Duke Ellington did the Far East Suite, and which is essentially an early world music album. And there's tons of stuff going. I mean, if you get out of this narrow framework, I was trying to limit myself just to what was on the radio in answering your question. Of course, if you like the jazz in 1966 was expanding in every direction, and obviously in classical music, a lot of things were going on as well, and it is a moment when there was a big generational shift just about to happen, and I think what we're talking about with Revolver and Pet Sounds, and also Lee Scratch Perry doing People Funny Boy, it's the moment when you're starting to hear the first tremors of the earthquake that is coming, which is in fact generational. When a whole new generation is going to come and redefine the contours of everything that we're talking about. They were still doing it within an older music industry in 1966.
I'm going to ask a last question, and then I'm just going to show one record because we've been going an hour and a half, and we want to keep this contained.
Yeah, of course.
So if we look at 66, 67, I mean, and I was born in 66, so kind of interesting. But, because everybody's been going on about like avant-garde and experimental. What can you tell us that was happening at that time? Or electronic?
In electronic.
Electronic, avant-garde, experimental music, 66, 67. How you would look at it in terms of your musical world?
I don't know. I think for me, in terms of how I relate to electronic music, the big shift comes a little bit later, which is with Robert Moog and the advances in synthesizer technology that really shifted and allowed these things to become much more accessible. I have a lot of Moog records, which are more like from like circa 1970, like the Wendy Carlos stuff, and who was the Japanese guy who did the WC 2000 project? That stuff. That's all like right around 1970, and then the Clockwork Orange soundtrack, which is basically the original version of which has been withdrawn, but the copies of that are still widely available. That's 72. That stuff is more where I start to see an influence of electronic music go much bigger in the stuff that I listen to than what I'm interested in. Specifically in South African terms, General MD Sharinda, who I also had the very good fortune and very good happenstance to meet and to interview and to work with. I visited him at his kraal in Limpopo. I was with his whole extended family. He was the first person to record an album for Gallo Records, an LP, recorded an LP using a synthesizer. The first South African artist, 1976. That's a certifiable fact. MD Sharinda was the guy who introduced the synthesizer as a main group instrument on an LP, rather than just a novelty record. Or
that was even way pre-Kwaito and all of that. I mean, that's like also so.
What Sharinda did, then that lays the groundwork for all these guys, Thomas Chalka and Chico and all other Shangaan producers who came later. So that is that stuff. And by that period, by the mid 70s, also in Nigerian music, you start to hear increasing use of synthesizer. I'm fascinated by that stuff. The experiments with electronic music and these type of instruments in the 1960s were coming more from the field of avant-garde European classical music.
Yeah, I've got some ballet and stuff there. Yeah, but I mean,
I've got
a couple, but it's not. It's just it's not like I want to complete everything. I didn't grow up with it. I grew up in South Africa, but there are people like I mentioned, Stanty. He's got like shelves and shelves of that kind of stuff. But
I mean, great. Awesome stuff. Of course. It's just you asked me what I was mainly interested in, and I find Stockhausen and the Darmstadt school. I respect it, and it's really important in terms of the history of European music. But I don't really listen to music like that at home. It doesn't swing for me. It doesn't have a bounce. It doesn't have a joy that I want to hear, even in classical music. That stuff is very cold, very clinical, very technological, but it's hugely important in terms of introducing these ideas and these concepts. And obviously, people like Paul McCartney and Brian Wilson heard Stockhausen on records, and especially Hymnen, which came out around that same time on Deutsche Grammophon or whoever put it out. I've listened to that, but it's not something that's just hugely important in my own tastes. But of course, it's a largely and wildly important record in terms of the development of rock music, also. And I'm sure Gainsbourg also knew it. It's very influential and very seminal stuff from this same time period. I was just framing my answer to what you asked me about my own taste. I like how the synthesizer bent and deformed into being an African percussion instrument in other cultures, which is not what Bob Moog probably intended for it to be, but That's how I like to relate to it.
I know, no. That's the answer that I wanted, because what I'm saying is I've got into some of that music, but it's not. I don't want to complete my shelves. I listen to it, but there are some people that are completists, and if I'm into to sort of Jap psych, and I'm into crowd stuff for certain reasons. But I'm not a completist. I have a little top shelf of a couple of records of every genre. I've got some Stockhausen that I like. I don't want it all, Some stuff is unlistenable, but there are completists, and this is where what I'm trying to get to is like, I think if we take it all, we understand the global connection of music, and we bring it together. That for me is the most important thing. I mean, I can't imagine me. I'm just saying, I could not own. If I owned every Sun Ra record, it would be like wasted space.
Okay, I would rather have every Sun Ra record than every Stockhausen record, but I like.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yes, their own taste. I'm not a completist. I'm not a serial number collector, and I'm not someone who really obsesses about mono versus stereo pressings. It's not the way that I listen to music. I listen to music because it's inspiring to me. It's connected to all other art forms for me. The way that I relate to film, to painting, to dance, to video art, to conceptual art, everything for me stems from my love of music. And my love of music imbues me with wanting to understand rhythm and how rhythm influences our body and can make our life better just by dancing and moving more often and being inspired by music to move in whatever way it moves us. That's more important to me than the physical object or the medium of the collector. Although I am in awe and I have huge respect for and great interest in these legendary record collectors. I just don't aspire to do that. It's just not. I my flat is filled with records and books and stuff as it is. I don't need to own that much more. Even as it is, like I go out and buy several records every week, but it's stuff that I'm curious to listen to because it's a curiosity for me that is something weird or something unusual or just something that I want to hear. They're often very cheap records. I seldom spend a lot of money on buying a specific record. I do, of course, but it's not that usual. It's not my standard way of operating within the vinyl culture or within the music culture.
So I wanna kind of cut this between bits. I'm actually gonna show 3 CDs, and then I'm gonna throw something at you. So this is something that a mate of mine reminded me about the other day. I got on CD. I mean, I wish I had the record, but that's Will Burroughs' Spare Ass Annie with that hip hop. You know that one?
Yes.
Spare Ass Annie and Other Tales.
And Other Tales.
We were just. Yeah, this is something I picked up. I mean, if I can get these on vinyl, I think they were on cassette. I've got a couple when I was in Cambodia, but this is like Cambodian psych. It's on a Shingden label.
Wow, what is that?
This is Asian psych. I mean, if I could get these on vinyl, you can barely. I mean, I bought a couple of these when I had some various trips to Cambodia.
What is that? What is the music? I have no idea what that is.
I would say it's like 60s, 70s kind of. Asian psych's got the voice is like that Mongolian voice. You don't totally see it as. I've got some Mongolian psych here as well. It's that higher. It's a higher note, an octave. So people, but it's really trippy music. I mean, it's yeah. I'll try and get some of these to you. I mean, I think these are even bootlegs. You can't find this stuff. I'll see if I can. I bought these in Cambodia, literally off the streets.
I see that. I'm curious what it is. I have no idea.
I mean, it's.
Wow.
We used to go to a bar also in Phnom Penh called the the Zeppelin bar that sadly closed. I mean, that's a legendary. He was a Taiwanese guy who only played vinyl. I've got another story about that, but this shit is just really, really amazing. I wish. I mean, I saw them at markets and I bought 2 or 3, not knowing the music then. Now I should have bought all like 20 in the series. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
You can't find them.
and
And then the last one. This was released on. Yeah, this was released on vinyl. It was the Maibuya Institute. I think Steve Gordon was involved in this. I don't know if you've seen this. Freedom Song South Africa.
No, I
This
didn't
is
know
a
that
CD.
at all.
Yeah, and so on this, it's a double CD. But that's the cover. But you've got just to go through this because this is so important. And then the last one is going to really. So you go from early freedom songs. Let's just see what's on here. God, my eyes. Roy Kala. I mean, it's all like traditional choirs, ANC songs, documentary images and text. Maibuya making music production. So that was Steve Gordon. Let me just see. Roy Tata Mandela in a fight to translations. There's some titles. Then you've got Zaka Bule performed by Maibuya. Then choir ANC choir Angola. So,
Yeah,
this
Maya Boya was a official cultural ensemble that existed abroad, I think from Zambia, but who they toured Europe, and so you can find Maya Boya records that were recorded in East Germany and also in West Germany for that matter. But they were one of these vocal ensembles who performed South African traditional music across several languages. As far as I know, I have 2 of their records, which I think are both East German pressings.
Well,
But I don't know
you
much.
put that one. It's like that ANC with Gwangwa. There's on this one. You've got they show with the Melodia in Cyrillic.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
that's probably Kwankwa or what? No, sorry, it's Amanla is Gwangwa's thing. Amanla was a different ensemble, which Jonas Gwangwa was the South African jazz trombonist who former collaborator of Masekela and Miriam Makeba, who we mentioned earlier. But he had the Amanla ensemble, which was different than Boya. But I think this stuff is really obscure. If you we can speak about this some other time, but I have those records. I can get them out and speak about them.
Absolutely, that's what I want to start opening it up. And then the last thing, and I'm going to throw it back to what you said about Gainsbourg and getting back to the Flame, and obviously Blondie Chaplin's relationship with Keith Richards and all of that is, obviously for me, Gainsbourg made some masterpieces. Having married a French woman, divorced now, but and I'd had Gainsbourg before that. I've got into other French music she gave me a lot of, but I mean, obviously, the Melody de Nelson is a psychedelic masterpiece for me. But then there's his reggae album that he did, with Sly and Robbie in Jamaica. But also, not many people are aware, and I've been on various vinyl community streams where I keep mentioning Keith Richards and Miss Angels with Blondie Chaplin when they went to Jamaica.
Yeah, but that's an obscure record, and part of the reason for that people wouldn't know that is that only came out on vinyl as a reissue a few years ago, and that was a super expensive, like collector's rare edition for fans. The actual edition of Wingless Angels that came out in 1995 was only on CD. It wasn't distributed through mass channels. It was the way it was packaged deliberately didn't identify it as a Rolling Stones related product because Keith Richards didn't want to put it out that way. He really wanted to produce a record of these Rasta gramations that were happening on his property and around his house because he felt that it was really beautiful and moving music. I personally think that the Wingless Angels stuff is among the best things that Keith Richards was ever involved with, including Beggar's Banquet and Rain Dogs by Tom Waits, which are 2 of my favorite albums. But that Wingless Angels is up there with those in terms of things that Keith Richards has done that he's contributed. I think it's an amazing and remarkable work. I agree, but I'm not surprised that nobody knows it because it's just somehow damned obscure. As it's impossible to buy. Really. It's a very difficult thing to find and to have access to. I'm lucky that I have a CD of it, which I sought out at the time because I was curious about it. But it's a really hidden gem of music, which is crossing a lot of different continents and different trajectories. It's not just that Blondie Chaplin is on that, but there are several Irish traditional musicians and traditional West of Ireland fiddle players and members of the Neville Brothers are also on it. It's really like a very unique cast of characters that Keith Richards brought together basically to do home recordings at his then home in Jamaica. That's all around this hymn-like nature of Nyabingi Rastafari devotional music. I mean, just talking about it, I can tell why this doesn't appeal to people. It's a deliberately obscure thing, but if you really know music and listen to music and go deep with music, it's almost like a free jazz album or a spiritual jazz album. It has unique qualities that are superb, and I think Blondie Chaplin and also, God, why can't I think of his name? The other backing singer for Rolling Stones.
Oh,
Bernard Fowler. Those guys, they're
God,
adding. They add their harmonies to what the Rasta guys are already doing, and that just elevates it. It's just a remarkable record. Thank you for bringing that up. I'm happy to have any chance to talk about that record.
I'm going to end this stream now, but I just want you to stay. But I really want to thank you, and I'm just going to say, whoever kind of came in and out tonight, my last words tonight, because we've got so much more that'll come over a period of time, because Keith's not going to be around all the time. But my last words tonight are Jah Rastafari. Rest well, and may there be peace in the world. Keith, hang in. I'm ending the stream, but I'm going to chat to you. Thanks, everyone, for watching, and lots of love. I'm going to just hit 40 man's thing. Thank you. Lots of love. Keith, I'm ending it. Jah Rastafari, everybody, and we're ending, and we're over and out.